Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Someone once asked, who will police the police? To which the great philosopher of our time, Homer Simpson, replied, I don't know, the Coastguard. Of course, Australia doesn't have a Coastguard. Today's Maritime Matters webinar, we're discussing why Australia needs one, marking the online launch for a new paper written by Jennifer Parker of the Australian Naval Institute titled Time for a Coastguard. My name is Andrew Tillett, and I'm the Defence and Foreign Affairs correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. Jennifer had a career of more than 20 years in the Navy, specialising as a principal warfare officer, and in her final role was Director of Operations in Bahrain for the Combined Maritime Forces, the 38-nation coalition promoting national security in the Middle East and Indian Ocean region. After leaving the Navy a couple of years ago, Jennifer has become one of the leading go-to experts in Australia for commenting on naval matters, a breath of fresh air in this space, and is regularly quoted in newspapers and TV programs offering her assessment and sharing her knowledge. Jennifer in her paper makes the case that maritime infrastructure is being targeted globally and the divide between civil and military threats is becoming blurred. And nowhere is this trend more evident than in the South China Sea, where we see Coastguard vessels from the Philippines and China increasingly clashing on the geopolitical front line. Jennifer makes the case that Australia needs a Coastguard to fill this gap, with the Navy best placed to concentrate on high-end warfighting, while Border Force stays focused on civil law enforcement. We're going to hear first from Jennifer to discuss her paper, before handing over to our panellists today, co-panellists for today, Professor Strating and Lee Goddard. Beck is Director of La Trobe Asia and Professor of International Relations at La Trobe University. She's also one of Australia's top maritime experts, co-author of this year's GERT IC, Reimagining Australia's Security, and a regular media commentator. Beck is going to take us through the evolution of maritime security threats and the strategic implications of having a coastguard in today's era of geopolitical rivalry. Lee retired as a Rear Admiral after 34 years in the Navy, culminating in his appointment as Commander, Maritime Border Command and Operation Sovereign Borders, responsible for the law enforcement and operational oversight of Australia's maritime and economic security zones, an area that covers 10% of the Earth's surface. Lee is currently working for and advising several defence companies in the industry, and I'm looking forward to his on-water experience of maritime law enforcement. And after the remarks, we're going to turn the conversation over to you, our audience, for about 25 minutes of Q&A. So please type out any of your questions that you've got, and we'll try and get who they're intended for, and we'll try and get through as many as possible we have in the time. Now, I'd like to hand you over to our author, Jennifer Parker.
Hey, thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks so much to my fellow panelists. Of course, all very well known, much more well known in this space than me, but Professor Beck Strating, I say good things. She's also one of my PhD supervisors, and of course, Rear Admiral Lee Goddard, a former commander of a Maritime Border Command, amongst many other prestigious appointments. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which I come to you from, the Ngunnawal people, and also acknowledge our ADF veterans or veterans from other organisations who may be online. I guess the kind of point that I want to touch on first is why did I write this? And I guess part of it is when we talk about a coastguard in Australia, people generally roll their eyes or they groan or they say, yeah, Beazley tried to do this in the early 2000s. It just didn't work. We really don't need to revisit it now. And I guess one of the things that I was thinking about kind of 12 months ago now was, well, we've talked a lot about capability in response to the Defence Strategic Review. We've talked about workforce problems. We've talked about our defence industrial policy settings. Now, I'm not saying that we've solved any of these things, but we're trying to attack some of these things in response to what has been the deterioration of the strategic environment, which is manifesting very clearly in the maritime domain. But one of the things we really haven't talked about is, are our structures appropriate to deal with these changes? And I think that that's a really important conversation. One of the challenges with structural issues is that you can't just change them overnight. They require forward planning, they require thinking. And so, why I'm thinking about are our national security structures adequate? The most obvious one to me, and I guess given my background in maritime, was, are our maritime security structures adequate? And a lot of people have written on this, and I guess I came to the conclusion that I really think they aren't. And as much as it's a question about, can you manage, if they're not adequate, can you just manage that risk, which is what I think we've been doing for the last 20 years? The question is, with the reduction of strategic warning time, the increased conversation about the chances of a conflict in the region, do we need to look at these structures now? Now, of course, when we talk about our maritime security structures, they're not all geared around the chances of conflict or around crisis. Actually, a lot of it is geared around the daily law enforcement and policing operations that we need to undertake in our maritime domain, which, I think everybody online probably knows these figures, right? But we have the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. Our maritime domain is actually bigger than our landmass. It's a pretty big area. So that was kind of where I came at the paper from. As I started to think about, well, what has changed? Because a lot of people said to me, but why revisit it now? Like, what is the benefit? We need to be focused on other things. And I thought, well, when did we last seriously have a conversation around our maritime security architecture? And it really was 20 years ago, in 2004. We had a joint standing committee on foreign affairs, defence and trade, which looked at Australia's maritime strategy. I think it had about 9 recommendations, almost none of which have been enacted 20 years on. And we also had, around that time, a review called the Tonkin Review, which looked at our maritime security architecture. Now, the Tonkin Review is not publicly available. Some of you online have almost certainly read that and probably contributed to that. It is classified. But what we do know from the Tonkin Review is that it recommended the current structure of Maritime Border Command. And a lot of that was geared on the thought of, or the threat of maritime terrorism. You've got to remember this era is post 9/11. There is a real focus on the fact that the maritime domain would probably be the next domain of choice for terrorists. Now, that didn't necessarily manifest the way people predicted, but it made us look at our architecture. Now, allegedly, the Tonkin Review considered a Coastguard for Australia and actually decided against it and went with our Maritime Border Command structure that we currently have as a multi-agency structure. Now, a lot of things have changed, though, in the last 20 years. The first thing is we know a lot more about Maritime Border Command. And I think, despite the hard work of the women and men who work there and of the ABF Maritime Unit that supports Maritime Border Command, we know that it's had resourcing issues for 20 years. It relies heavily on the Australian Defence Force, particularly the Royal Australian Navy, for workforce, for assets. From what you can glean from the publicly available information, some of it is dated, but there are plenty of examples of us sending billion-dollar warships and amphibious craft and tankers to do what is illegal fishing and irregular migration. The second thing that has changed in the last 20 years is the nature of maritime threats have changed. I think Beck might talk on this a little bit, so I won't go too much into it, but we are seeing this blurring of civil and military. The third thing that has really changed is we've had a defence strategic review that says that the ADF should be focused on high-end warfighting. It talks about the fact that we shouldn't be bringing the ADF into daily constabulary or disaster relief operations. Now, when the DSR was written, I don't think it was necessarily thinking about maritime law enforcement operations. It was more thinking about how we respond to bushfires and floods. But arguably, using the Navy and the Air Force and the Army, but predominantly the Navy for a lot of our maritime border operations, is actually the same thing as using the ADF for disaster relief. It's using our capabilities for civil functions when the DSR and the National Defence Strategy tells us that we have to have a different focus for that. So those 3 things have really changed over the last 20 years. And that's why I've advocated for the fact that I think we need to relook at it. Now, what structure should that be? I don't have a lot of time to go into that. The paper suggests a structure which is a paramilitary Coastguard with a different level of training to what we currently provide to our ABF Maritime Unit, removing that responsibility in terms of the patrol force from the Royal Australian Navy, pushing that to the Coastguard and putting that under the Department of Home Affairs. Now, there is a lot of conversation about where such an organisation should fit. That's a similar model to the US, where it actually does not sit under the US Department of Navy, as much as a lot of people think that's the case. The reason I thought about that is there's a lot of things that this Coast Guard needs to do, right? And part of the paramilitary focus is having the ability to scale it up to support operations and support our maritime home defence. But at its core, we need to remember that it is a maritime law enforcement organisation, which is why I've recommended that structure. Now, I'm at the 7-minute mark, and I'm cognizant that we have two excellent panellists to talk, so I might leave my remarks there.
Beck, if you'd like to chime in now, I think it'd be a good time.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Lee, but most importantly, thank you, Jen, both for inviting us to be on this panel and to celebrate the soft launch of your terrific paper, but also for contributing this paper to the debate, because your first recommendation is that Australia should consider a review into Australia's maritime security requirements, including a Coast Guard. And I could not agree with you more. It is definitely time to reassess those debates about what benefits an Australian Coast Guard might offer. And for all of the reasons that Jen has already offered, but particularly when we are thinking about the evolution of security threats. And Jen has already mentioned the blurring of civil and military threats. I mean, if we look out into our region and we can see the militarization of Coast Guard and civilian vessels in order for states to achieve strategic ends, this seems to be a significant dynamic in the maritime security environment, these hybrid or so-called grey zone threats that are designed to fall below the threshold of armed attack or conflict, but are incredibly destabilizing and are presenting all sorts of challenges, particularly to smaller and middle powers in Southeast Asia. In the South China Sea, we can see that the Philippines are at the forefront of some of these aggressive and assertive grey zone tactics, as well as the Philippines and other claimant states. In the East China Sea, we see daily incursions into what the Japanese would claim as their waters around Senkaku Dieo, as well as other grey zone tactics, and of course in the Taiwan Strait. So this evolution of a security threat around hybrid war is also taking place in the context of broader strategic competition, and the maritime domain is a central theatre for that strategic competition. And in our region, I mean, the most two important actors there are the United States and China. So, as Jen points out, the last time we had a significant debate about this, the most politically salient issue for Australia's Maritime Border Command has actually been the handling of unauthorised maritime arrivals. And this is particularly the case as asylum seekers became securitised in Australia and within political discourse. And the context in which the Labor Party proposed an Australian Coast Guard in the early 21st century was by arguing that national borders were, and I quote, at risk from people smugglers, gun runners, drug smugglers, illegal fishing, and of course terrorists. Some of these are still pertinent, but it's no doubt that the strategic reality for Australia and for the region and globally has dramatically shifted since that time, which means that it is a good time not just to reevaluate our structures and to determine whether they are fit for purpose, which is what Jen is doing here, but also there's the issue of whether our policy settings more generally are fit for purpose, because this issue of the Coast Guard is nested within a broader set of policy questions about whether or not Australia has an effective national security strategy, one that is joined up, one that is whole of government, one that can deal with issues of coordination across multiple agencies. And there's also the issue of a maritime security strategy more broadly. As Jen's paper points out, the siloing of national security and civil maritime security is a feature of Australia's declaratory policy that indicates the absence of an overarching sense of maritime security or an overarching sense of strategy, bringing those two dimensions together. But of course, it's not just naval. It's not just civil, it's also about environmental security, human security, economic security, sustainability. These are complex and overlapping issues. We can think about the ways in which illegal fishing is at once can be used as a grey zone tactic, but also can be accidental. It can also, just be something that local fishers are doing. It has implications for biodiversity, sustainability, food security, and so on. So I think this is really timely. I do have a provocative question for Jen, though, because her second recommendation is that Australia should establish a Coast Guard. And this one is interesting because you've kind of jumped from needing a review to answering the question of the review, which is, yes, we need a Coast Guard. So my question to you is, what happens if a rigorous and evidence-based review finds that the cost of establishing a Coast Guard outweighs the benefits? I suspect that what the review is actually really important for is political will. We were just talking about that before other people came on the call. And I think the paper presents a persuasive argument for a Coast Guard. There are some areas where I think the evidence needs to be strengthened about what kind of problems the current multi-agency approach has and whether or not a Coast Guard would actually fix some of these issues. The paper talks about professionalism, maintenance issues, capacity. Well, militaries have those problems as well. So, I think in terms of developing a very rigorous and clear evidence base, there are some other questions to be addressed. The other one is this an institutional structural issue, or is this a capability issue at its heart? And I think, there is a really, clear direction of making that argument crystal clear, that it's not just about what we have, but it's how agencies are able to coordinate in order to be able to use these. So I just want to end on two questions, if I may. The thing about the civil and military threat is, in our region, we're really talking about China. So the question is, what extent is Australia facing civil and military hybrid threats in the maritime domain at the moment? And what do we anticipate happening in Australia's extensive EEZ? I think this is one way of trying to develop a fuller case for a Coast Guard. And the second is Coast Guard in regional cooperation. The importance of Australia in dealing with blue crime as a transnational issue in cooperation with our neighbours in support of good order at sea. It's actually not just about state-based threats, but it's about the long range of maritime security challenges. And if we have a Coast Guard, it might actually make it easier for us to cooperate with other Coast Guards in the region. Thank you.
Excellent. Beck, please, if anyone wants to put some questions in, we're ready to hear from you guys. And we'll get into the Q&A after Lee's spoken. But please use the chat box or the Q&A box to put in some questions if you'd like to. And now I'll hand over to Lee Goddard after that very good section from Beck posing some good questions there.
Thanks, Andrew, and well done, Beck. Particularly that question, is this a capability versus other issues that we're trying to address? And well done, Jennifer. As you know, I'm not 100% we need a Coast Guard right now, but I'm certainly think we need to review the maritime threats require a structural rethink. Absolutely, the situation has changed. And even since I was commanding Maritime Border Command and in the second half of my command, when we assumed also Operation Sovereign Borders in 2019, 2020, the situation has changed. And I know that some of the audience straight away will come back and say, we don't need another force, or we don't have enough people ready for the Navy. Why would we be moving to a separate Coast Guard, or why doesn't the Navy take it? We've heard all those debates. I think it's important that we actually have a look at those again. I also know not only Neil Bennett's article a few months ago in ASPE, when he talks about Australia needing a Coast Guard to fight and win in the grey zone, as Beck's alluded to, but also about the Quad and actually how we may operationalise the Quad. When I was commanding Maritime Border Command, even though I worked for the Commission of the Australian Border Force, essentially I was commanding a de facto Coast Guard, and the rest of the region saw me as the head of the Australian Coast Guard. I would go represent Australia at the head of Asian Coast Guard meetings with AMSA, the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, who is our co-partner. I go to a number of meetings as the de facto head of the Coast Guard. So it's very important about how it's seen regionally as well. I also know some of Jennifer's history there, the Tonkin Review in 2004, when we actually were first called the Offshore Protection Command. And then, of course, incidents such as 2001 with Tampa and, of course, the unauthorised arrival issue. Then it's iterations to become Border Protection Command, and then, of course, Maritime Border Command, working in the Department of Home Affairs and working for the Commissioner of the Australian Border Force. A couple of things just operationally for those aren't aware. Andrew mentioned 10% of the Earth's surface, and that's correct. Our security area of authority overlaps our search and rescue zone, which is 10% of the Earth's surface. It is a phenomenal area. North, obviously, into our Southeast Asian region, east into the Pacific, west into the Indian Ocean, and south into the Southern Ocean. No country has more responsibility proportionally versus its size in terms of population for its maritime environment. It's ironic we're called Earth. We should be called water, because not enough Australians understand how much we're actually responsible for, including our 45%, obviously, historical claim on Antarctica. There's a couple of things, of course, that drives maritime border command. First of all is the very effective Maritime Powers Act of 2013. Now, Australians sometimes sell ourselves short on things, but we actually do multi-agency and interagency much better than we give ourselves credit for. And the Maritime Power Act has actually allowed, of course, not just the Australian Border Force and Maritime Border Command working with its primary partner, Defence, but across a range of other agencies, in some cases clients such as fisheries or aquas or other state agencies, but those also who support, such as intelligence agencies, Australian Federal Police, etc. as well, to work together under a very effective legal framework. The other thing that we probably don't refer to enough is what's called the GAMSA, which is the Guide to Australian Maritime Security Arrangements. In fact, it was first developed and I guess led authored by then Commander, Border Protection Command, then Rear Admiral David Johnston, our current Chief of Defence Force. It's actually a very good document covering all the actual threats that the Maritime Border Command or the de facto Coast Guard has to protect Australia from. I, in 2020, was able to work with our Commissioner to get that authorised across, I think it was 17 government agencies. Still, actually, I read it yesterday, it's still relatively current in terms of actually why we actually need to have this de facto Coast Guard called Maritime Border Command. But even those threats have evolved. I mean, some of the threats that Beck just described, I mean, plus there's state actors, non-state actors, criminals, accidental criminals, obviously there's unauthorised arrivals, there's drug smuggling. We've just detected 2.3 tonnes of cocaine and a very good Australian Border Force, Maritime Border Command, AFP operation just this week. So we actually have to understand what those threats are and how we're going to deal with those as they actually evolve. I always used to remind my team, your adversary, who I just described, they have to think they're being watched, whether they are being watched or not. And you have to have the capability and systems not only to do that, but also have to have the assets and the people to make sure you can respond, because then your adversary will behave differently. And that's what we're actually ultimately trying to do. But I think the really questions that Jen has raised, and of course Beck's also challenged on some, that if a review and then the cost of a Coast Guard versus our current interagency, multi-agency system means that we should continue the way we are. I think that's an important conversation, but still, where do those assets come from? Who pays? And what is the clear command and control system going forward that which will adapt to the militarisation and grey zone activity, which is now crossing over between traditional civil maritime threats and, to be frank, military threats. But back to you, Andrew.
Thanks for that, Lee. As always, who pays? Being from the Financial Review, it's often something that I often are fascinated by. But it's sort of in that vein of what Lee left us off there, Jennifer. You propose in your paper that essentially a transfer of assets and personnel from the Navy to the new Coast Guard, without wanting to open a turf war, would that be something the Navy is open to, both at the sort of the senior commander level, the chiefs level, as well as people down in the, not in the trenches, so to speak, but in the, the sailors and things like that? Would people be happy to transfer to the Navy to a new Coast Guard, first of all? And if Lee, if you'd like to chime in as well. As both of you got that operational experience in the Navy.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks so much, Lee and Beck. I really, really appreciate your comments. And what I'm trying to have here is a conversation about this. I'm certainly not starting from the premise that I am necessarily right. And if you know Brendan Nicholson, a famous Australian journalist, was the editor of Aspie. When I first started writing on these things, he said, well, get your opinion out there. He said, there's no reason you can't change your opinions. And I think that's a great way to think about it. Beck, just firstly on your comments, absolutely. It's a bit cheeky to have the first recommendation, there should be a review, and the second recommendation saying, hey, I know the answer to the review. I do think that there is enough anecdotal evidence that a change is necessary. And that anecdotal evidence goes from, and again, it's difficult. It is difficult in the public domain because there's not a lot of public available evidence on it. You're dating things back. But there is available in the public domain examples of where we're sending billion-dollar warships to do illegal fishing and irregular migration, and many of the people who are on here have sat on those ships doing that. So there is a resource issue. The second thing is every annual report from Home Affairs clearly highlights that the ABF Maritime Unit, despite their professionalism, do not meet their government-directed targets. There's an ANAO audit that rips apart the contracting for aerial surveillance hours. I could go on and on. So I think there's enough there to suggest that the current element isn't necessarily working. So I think it is a structural rather than just a capability issue. And probably the final point that convinces me of that is actually there's a 2019 piece written by the late Rear Admiral James Goldrick, a very, very familiar and influential in the current construct we have. And he says that the way that the ABF Maritime Unit has been structured is it can never grow the capability to manage its own capability, training, etc., to give the function that we want. And now he's actually a supporter that Maritime Border Command was the right structure and actually the ABF Maritime Unit that need to be addressed. I would disagree with him on that point, which is dangerous to disagree with him. But I guess that's where I'm kind of coming at it. Andrew, to your comment about workforce, Navy workforce is one of my favourite things to talk about. Once upon a time, I worked in career management, and I guess, look, this does require analysis, right? Because this is all opinion based. Certainly, my experience and my recommendations in this is shaped by my experience of having to post people to patrol boats who did not want to go to patrol boats and people from patrol boats who did not want to go to warships. Now, that's anecdotal evidence, but I guess when I talk to a lot of my colleagues in the US Coast Guard, who I spoke to extensively about this paper, it is a different kind of person who is keen to do the maritime law enforcement function than is necessarily focused on high-end warfare. And it is quite a different skill set. I think we waste some training trying to have people across both. We waste some currency. So my view is I actually think that, because some of the criticism is, well, this just makes the Navy workforce problem worse. I have a lot of views on the Navy workforce problem, but we don't have hours to talk about it. Not necessarily. Maybe it actually goes form to function. We actually just allocate the workforce who are already doing that function across to the area that is responsible for that function and have the appropriate training, etc., associated with it. There are lengthy career continuums at the moment for those sailors and officers that have to go to patrol boats, then have to go to warships, etc. Now, many online might say I'm biased because I never served in a patrol boat, but that would be my thoughts on the workforce. Lee, I'm sure you've got some key thoughts on that.
I won't go to workforce, but I may just go to Andrew's question about who pays. It goes without saying the business of a Navy, and of course we have a Navy. In fact, our second biggest Navy shortly will actually in the region will actually be our Army. But even our Australian Border Force and Maritime Border Command, it is a very expensive business, and you can't take it lightly to say we'll just create something and not actually understand the cost implications of that. Throughout my period in Maritime Border Command, I think we were successful because of our interagency structure and the flexibility to use not just Border Force assets, but Australian Defence Force assets, and where needed, other government agency assets. But at times we did just get by. So I think that's why the structural reform is actually needed to make sure, and I know structural reforms needed to make sure that Home Affairs and the Border Force, who actually ultimately are responsible for Maritime Border Command where it currently is, or the de facto Coastguard, has the structures in place and also has the budget in place to ensure that they can do what they do, and also to ensure that other government agencies can get the services they require as well. We've had goes at qualifying and quantifying that, and it's a very expensive number. So you need to really understand that. That said, Commissioner Michael Outram in his recent final speech in the National Press Club, did mention about Maritime Border Command, civil maritime threats, and actually, and it did surprise me, Michael was so overt, said it is now time for Australia to consider a Coastguard, clearly within Home Affairs and within the Australian Border Force construct.
Beck, one of the points you made was about the securitisation of essentially, I guess, asylum seeker management. I remember, 2001 as well, the debate around a Coast Guard. I think it was actually Mike Pizzullo, who was in Beasley's office at the time, who sort of cooked up the plan. So he might be, if we do a second webinar, worth getting on to ask him about it. But I mean, so I think that sort of securitisation of it has sort of probably clouded the debate around a Coast Guard. But also, too, I'm fascinated by one of the points that Lee made about, about adapting to grey zone and things like that. Because as an outsider here, when I see what's happening in the South China Sea with those clashes between the Philippines and the Chinese vessels, I often think that, are the Chinese sort of pushing the envelope a little bit more because they are just a, quote, Coast Guard rather than coming up against a Navy sort of vessel. So I wonder if in this discussion of grey zones, whether there is actually merit in having sort of, the grey ships with the white ensign, the gun at the front, things like that, it sort of sends a bit of a message of don't mess with me. So if you'd like to weigh in, maybe Pastor 3.
Yeah, sure. So on the first sort of comment about securitisation, this is a term that sort of gets used in international relations. It basically means that particular challenges are presented as security threats within a political discourse because there's a political purpose for doing so. So in the case of asylum seekers, this was obviously for years a significant sort of political football that would be used by political parties in order to have some sort of political effect. And this sort of securitisation then has an effect on policy. And, Home Affairs, I think, comes out of this securitisation of asylum seekers. The concern that I have at the moment, and I think about this quite a lot because the way that I see maritime security is that it encompasses a whole bundle of challenges, security challenges, but those that affect humans, that affect livelihoods, that affect states, that affect non-state actors, that affect the environment. And so partly my concern is that we're just securitizing, there's a potential to just securitize all of it. And then we have an ADF that potentially is trying to do everything. Climate change is a really good example of this. Like, how much should we be securitizing climate change? Is this the only way to get a country like Australia taking climate change seriously? Is if it's viewed through the lens of security. So that's the sort of the first piece, the first sort of set of issues around how we actually identify what is a security threat, how we create hierarchies of threats, and what we choose as a country to prioritize is a political process. The second about the grey zone activities, I have kind of forgotten what your question was, but I think there's something about China pushing the envelope. Definitely. The whole point of these harassment tactics campaigns is to try to change the status quo on the ground without provoking war. So there's other terms for them, salami slicing tactics or cabbage strategy. These are all incremental sort of approaches that are designed to have a strategic effect, but also to deny maritime use or maritime area to others. And that is really crucial because these are legally, they can be difficult to navigate because sometimes it's not clear what an armed attack is under international law or how countries define that. States across the region don't necessarily have uniform responses to these challenges or common understanding of what these challenges are. And crucially, states face different grey zone challenges. So that goes back to my question about what kind of grey zone challenges in the maritime do we in Australia expect to be facing? Because there's not going to be a 9-dash line around Australia. So what is it that we think we're going to be facing in the future, and how does a Coast Guard protect us from that?
And I might just add that comment. I think it's a really good point. I don't think it's realistic for Australia to expect to generate a Coast Guard and then for it to be operating in the South China Sea. I think that's something we need to be clear on. And I don't think anybody would actually be suggesting that. In the South China Sea, it's almost one country has taken the people's conflict to sea. They've used that conflict and actually taken it to sea. And that's why it's emergence not just of Coast Guards, but science vessels, fishing vessels, warships, everything you can think of in the maritime environment is there, confusing the situation. Australia needs to be very focused on our area from a constabulary point of view. And a Coast Guard, of course, delivers a maritime law enforcement effect. That's very important. That's in the first instance. Under our Maritime Powers Act, you can then deliver, for example, the Defence Force, Australian Federal Police, Border Force, quarantine, fisheries, etc., to deal with the actual threat to Australia's civil maritime security. So I think Beck makes a good point there about grey zone activity. Be very clear that it is real and nations will exploit our differences. Our Maritime Power Act, though, is very powerful in terms of allowing an interagency effect, but we certainly shouldn't be suggesting, because there's a grey zone threat in some other area in the world, that we should generate a Coast Guard to go deal with it. I don't think that would be a good idea. We need to focus on our area of responsibility, which is the 10% of the surface that we've previously described.
I'll just offer a comment, and then I might, Duncan has a question there that probably gets after this as well. Look, I completely agree. What I've tried to do in the paper is look at what are the functions of a Coast Guard, and what are some of the principles guiding those functions. For me, there's kind of two elements to that. One, it is a law enforcement function, but it's a paramilitary capability that can be scaled up to do other elements. What's glaring to me in our current architecture is it's unclear who's responsible for key elements of maritime security infrastructure protection, right? And that's one of the key trends we're seeing is maritime infrastructure being targeted. And of course, we can talk about subsea cables. In terms of the other one for me is kind of port defence, right? Who is actually responsible for that, and what are their capabilities? In terms of some of the threats that we could expect to see, certainly targeting of our maritime infrastructure. Somebody online, somebody very wise online said to me, what if, since we're talking about China, what if China one day said, okay, we're just going to send down a task group, maybe it's a Coast Guard task group to circle the oil platforms off the Northwest Shelf. Now, I know there's some people from the WA government online. We have limited capability up there and limited ability to respond to that. So I think there's some of the things that we're talking about. On the cost thing, look, I completely agreed. So the two criticisms very easily of this is workforce and cost, right? That's the thing that people throw out straight away. And if I was more diligent, I would have spent the next 12 months coming up with exact costing, which was actually recommended to me by a mentor, and an exact workforce plan. In terms of the costs, look, the costs are not in the same order of magnitude as some of the significant defence acquisitions that we are undertaking. And not that I'm saying it's one or the other, but I think there is a conversation about we are very focused at the moment on capability and acquiring capability. And what I'm trying to say is that there is a conversation that needs to be had about capacity of the organisation, of which capability is an element, but so is structure, so is workforce, so is process. In this case, the structure I'm talking about is a Coast Guard structure. When Labor costed this in 2004, they said it would be about 300 million, which is 500 million in our time over 5 years. Now, the capability they were talking about is not the capability we'd be suggesting here. It is very much an underestimate, but it's not in the order of billions of dollars, I guess, is the kind of point. Duncan, to your question about kind of, are we actually saying that, creating more organisations, right? And does that actually make it less clear? Look, there is an argument, but actually we have a significant amount of organisations that deal with maritime security. I mean, one of the stark things about our structure is that our search and rescue responsibilities are completely different to our maritime border command responsibilities, right? That's a clear and obvious one. And in the event of a crisis or conflict, and of course, complications short of that, there is an issue there. There's also probably a duplication of resources. And I know we have some people from AMSA online who might want to offer some comments on that. But I think there is the opportunity to really streamline what are our maritime security organisations and consolidate, and then be very clear about responsibilities. Beck mentioned our maritime strategy before. it's not clear on responsibilities. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure those who spent hours and weekends and nights drafting it put their best efforts into it. But we have a civil maritime strategy that says, yes, this is our civil maritime strategy, doesn't mention the word subsea cable or undersea cable, excludes pollution, excludes safety, excludes military. It's not very comprehensive as it is. So potentially this opportunity to look and create one larger organisation that is responsible for what I would say our maritime territorial defence and maritime law enforcement is a way to look at that. And I guess the final point I'd make is one of the other things that was kind of in the back of my mind with this, because I came at this not of how we bolster our maritime law enforcement, which is important, and that is a key argument for it, but I actually came at this from, okay, if we are going into a crisis and conflict, what is the vulnerability of our maritime domain, right? And a key element of that vulnerability is that we are saying that our Navy is going to be doing flock protection and supporting power projection and the Army's new amphibious fleet and protecting that. But also our civil maritime threats, which will increase. We're going to see more irregular migration. We're going to see more illegal fishing, threat of maritime terrorism, etc. But the Navy is also doing that too. So there's a resourcing issue in that. And so having a clear organisation who is responsible for that maritime territorial defence, we also need to talk about territorial defence more broadly, but that's a different webinar, is a way to streamline that. So I don't actually see this as creating more organisations and complicating it. I actually see this as reducing the number of organisations.
Thanks for that, Jen. Please, if you've got any more questions, send them in. I see we've got Ian Jarvie has put more observations rather than questions. So I think there's some interesting points there. Now, Ian tells us he's been the sponsor for the Navy's patrol boat capability as well as delivering the Guardians to the Pacific. That program, I think one of the points he makes there I think is interesting is that the Pacific step as part of an unstated grey zone response, absent assets to partner with those that we've gifted. These are the Guardians I imagine he's referring to because they're too busy doing domestic law enforcement tasks. I mean, in terms of a Coastguard, is there a soft power element to it as well, notwithstanding Lee's point about, sort of securing our immediate sort of area? Would you'd imagine it would go out a bit further afield into the Pacific, like the US sort of Coastguard? Is it sort of a bit of a outreach program as well as sort of constabulary responsibilities?
Shall I initially answer it just from a Maritime Border Command perspective? Absolutely, Andrea. There is, of course, but it's obviously prioritisation. Remember, the original quad, when I first joined the Navy, was actually the quad in the Pacific between Australia, the US, New Zealand and France, which did exactly that. It was US Coast Guard essentially led, where there was a lot of soft power activity. And of course, because we all diluted our interest and the assets we gave to that, actually did cause a number of issues in the Pacific that we're now actually trying to focus on. So absolutely. And it's a good point in the Pacific, actually having a big naval ship versus having a Coast Guard ship can make a difference about how you're actually received. Noting most of those Pacific countries actually don't either have a military as we know it or actually have either a police force or a kind of a lower level Coast Guards. Absolutely, there's a huge opportunity for soft power. But probably as Ian alluded to there, it's just been prioritisation. We just haven't had the assets compared to the higher priority threats to Australia, whether it be narcotics. And I know Jen mentioned West Australia. By the way, West Australia, we do care about the offshore patrol industry and we will protect it and we will surveil it before anyone suggests that us on the east are not doing our job. But of course, unauthorised arrivals has meant there's been a prioritisation issue because you can't be everywhere and do everything that you want to do.
Anyone else? I mean, Beck, do you have any thoughts about, the soft power value of a Coast Guard as well?
Yeah, there's a really interesting article written by Douglas Guilfoyle and Ed Chan, and they argued that the biggest beneficiary of the Pacific Patrol Boats program is Australia because it gives Australia's military and defence a footprint in the Pacific, and so that we actually get a lot of benefit out of it, more so than what perhaps the Pacific Island countries get out of it. It's kind of, I don't know whether we'd call that soft power or maybe sharp power, because it is the combination of hard power assets with, an effort, a desire to win hearts and minds, and to I think one of the key framing that is quite powerful is this idea of supporting other countries being able to defend their sovereign entitlements and maritime boundaries and claims. And that is, I think, in terms of a narrative, I think that is an important and powerful narrative.
Can I add one other thing? Jen, the head of Asian Coast Guard meeting that we attend as Command of Maritime Border Command actually has not just the head of, say, the Japanese Coast Guard, Korean Coast Guard, Indonesian Coast Guard, but also the head of the PLA, Chinese Coast Guard. And because you're actually talking not just about civil security threats, you're also talking about search and rescue and also, say, pollution and actually how you coordinate activity in the area. It allows countries that certainly wouldn't get together in military forums to get together to talk about more general maritime issues. Sorry, Jen.
No, absolutely. And just picking up on that point of soft power, it's partially the subject of my PhD, so it'll be revealed in 3 years or something. But I think it's a bit of an anomaly in Australia's history of how we're not positioned as a regional maritime power in some ways, right? And I think certainly we have a lot of initiatives through, whether that's training on law of the sea or helping countries settle their maritime boundaries, or the Pacific Maritime, I can't remember what it's called. I'm going to call it Pacific Patrol Boat Program. That's what it was called. It's called something else now, PMSP. But I do, one of the things I talk about in this paper is the idea of this Coast Guard Academy, right? Which is initially geared at providing a different level of training to our maritime law enforcement officials that they can scale up and support the Navy in certain functions. But also I think it has the opportunity to become a bit of a regional hub and a standard setter for regional coast guards. And I think that's something that, having spoken to some Pacific Island countries, some countries in Southeast Asia about it, I think that's something that there is actually some interest in doing. There is a lot of demand for Australia to provide training and engagement on these issues. So turning that into some sort of Coast Guard Academy that supports our domestic training, but also makes us more of a regional powerhouse or go-to or standard setter. They're not quite the right terms, but you get what I mean. I think also is a key soft power element that we could deliver. The second point, just moving away from soft power, but going on to Ian's point about the maritime skill set across Australia, right? Because again, this is one of the challenges, right? We're creating another organisation. We know we have a low base in terms of maritime skill set, which is something that is strange for a country like Australia. It's very much as a result of policy settings. I started thinking about the idea of a Coast Guard. A lot of it was after a conversation with Vice Admiral retired Peter Jones, where we were actually talking about Royal Fleet auxiliaries, we were talking about strategic fleets, and we were talking about what are all the elements of maritime power that you need to be a regional maritime power, right? And I think one of the elements in terms of a Coast Guard is it's also another opportunity, if we have the right policy settings and the right training, to broaden our maritime skill set and our maritime base. I think we don't have enough time to go into it, but I think there's a lot of opportunity, for example, for a Coast Guard reserve in the same way that in a different way that it's not as easy for a naval reserve, because it's different skill sets and different training. So I think there is a lot of opportunities in terms of broadening the mariner base.
I think just before we wrap up, just one final sort of question for me, in 25 words or less, or a little bit more than that. But how do we go about making the political will to deliver a Coast Guard? What is the argument that politicians understand? Is it a sort of a cost saving point of view that we're not going to have the $1 billion warships out there picking up wooden fishing boats, fishing illegally? An appeal to a vanity project. You getting the right defence minister who wants to be the first minister for the Coast Guard as well. What do we sort of need to do to make it happen here in Canberra?
Look, I'll offer a quick comment. I'm sure Lee, having engaged at these levels much more than me, has some more informed comments. I really think it's a conversation around risk. I think that short of a crisis is trying to highlight what the risk is and how it might manifest. And I do think in some ways, certainly defence planners have managed to do that effectively over the last couple of years with submarines and with the change in policy settings in the Defence Strategic Review. So it's what is the risk? How would that manifest? And then highlighting that probably doesn't cost as much as people think.
Well, I'd say probably three things. One, cost effectiveness. Absolutely. Secondly is actually effectiveness of actually doing the job. If the Navy is actually distracted with its primary role, which is the defence of Australia, you want to make sure your constabulary responsibilities are continuing as well to make sure you get that balance right. So that's a dynamic that we have to remind ourselves of as well, that, defence forces are primarily for that job, is actually to defend a nation. But it just happens that also they do constabulary roles very effectively as well as they work through. And I think thirdly is actually understanding that it doesn't necessarily mean, and by the way, I've still got to consider my full view, but doesn't mean more people. There's other ways we actually can do this as well to be an effective Coast Guard. I know that the founder of the OCS Bluebotter is actually watching us as we speak, Robert Dane. So there's actually other ways you can effectively achieve a Coast Guard with actually not throwing more people at it.
All right, I think I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can I just pop in with my 2 cents? And that goes back to the heart of Jen's first recommendation, which is a review. If you do a rigorous evidence-based review that costs the status quo versus other models that Lee just mentioned versus a Coast Guard, that convincingly says to the public that a Coast Guard in this environment is a no-brainer and that the benefits clearly outweigh the cost, then I think that's a first step in getting the political will and bringing people on board.
Thanks, Beck. And I think that's a good note. Let's do a review. That won't do us any harm, I think. And can certainly probably, it would be great to see the government kick off the conversation on that front. Thanks for everyone for your time. Jennifer's paper, of course, it's available, I think, at the Australian Naval Institute. If it's not online there already, I'm sure it'll be going up pretty soon, and you can have a browse of some of the other pieces that have been published over time at navalinstitute.com.au. Thanks very much for everyone for your insights for this discussion of on-water matters. Get it out of into the public, which is good. And today's recording will be available on the Maritime Matters podcast and the YouTube Maritime Matters YouTube channel. And obviously where you can get your good podcasts. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks very much for tuning in, and goodbye.
Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.